James, everybody happy with that? Thumbs up. Perfect. Thank you. So we're recording. Morning, Aaron. Morning, Kelly. If you've just joined, if you could mute, that would be great. And a few more joining now. Good morning, Kelly. Good morning, Rebecca. So Andre, if you could mute, or I can mute for you, but if you could mute Andre, that would be good. Morning, Clive. I think everybody's on mute. Except Andre. Well, I'll put Andre on mute. I'll mute him. Sorry, Andre, I've just muted you. Okay. Now 10:32. Leave it another few seconds, and then we'll start. So Steve Rumbles. Wow, that's a name from the past. Crikey. Who knows Steve Rumbles? I think everybody knows Steve Rumbles. Good morning, Steve Rumbles. Great to see you, Steve. Okay, right. It's now 10:33. As usual, welcome everybody to the coffee morning extravaganza. Every Tuesday, these are held at 10:30 in the morning. And we are delighted today that we've got Andy Cheseldine, who's chair of the Small Pots Coordination Group. And Andy and I go back quite some time. I remember having a coffee with you probably about 50 years ago, something like that. It feels like 50 years ago. But to welcome Andy, thank you very much. As usual, this session's being recorded. If you'd like to raise a hand to ask a question, that would be great. We do like interaction. The session, as I say, is being recorded, and we hope you enjoy it. So, Andy, over to you.
Thanks, Steve, and welcome everyone, and thank you for the interest. Can I just start by saying I've got some slides here. I'll take 20-ish minutes to go through. You'll see at the end there's a final slide with my email address. If anyone wants copies of the slides, they're welcome to them. If you want to ask a question, can I ask you just stick your hand up? I won't be able to see it because I'm concentrating on the slides, but ask Steve to interrupt me if it's something that needs to be said there and then. So what is or are the problems? Well, this is the crucial thing I think about small pots. It isn't one problem, it's a number of different ones, but we'll come to those in due course. Now, over 2 years ago, when the DWP had a working group on this, they quantified it as more than 3 million deferred savers investing in default options with pot sizes of under 100 quid, and a total of 10.5 million with deferred pot sizes under £1,000. And if we didn't do anything, then according to the PPI, there could be 27 million pots of under 2,000 by 2035. So clearly there's an incentive for everybody to do something here. It's already unmanageable, and it could become an existential threat to the industry. So what's happened about it? And sorry, this is a little bit of a history lesson to start with. The DWP chaired the initial working group, published the report in December 2020. And I think I might have said last time I spoke here that there had originally been a different small pots working group under the chairmanship of the late lamented Malcolm Small. And I was a member of that, but that was about 10 years ago. And it didn't get anywhere because there wasn't enough perception of the problem at that stage, I think it's fair to say. Following that DWP working group, the DWP passed the baton on to the industry. So there's a joint coordination group established between the ABI and PLSA, and that got set up 2021 with me chairing it. 3 sub-working groups, which frankly did most of the work, and those separately considered data, transfers and member detriment. And the chairs of those were Kim Gubler, member detriment was Stephen McDonald from Which, and Rob Ewell of the ABI chaired the transfers one. I've got to be careful because I keep on conflating Rob Ewell of the ABI and Robert Carroll of DWP, who's their main rep. Separate group working on member exchange and master trust, that's outside of the remit of this, though, because that working group was originally 4 of the larger auto enrollment master trusts, including Smart, I was on that as well. And of course, we shouldn't forget the dashboard project, which is hit the headlines quite a lot in the last few days. All of those led to an interim report in September last year. I've given you a link to that. And then since then, we've had further work from all the subgroups. And the next report was published June this year. And again, you've got a link there. And the main purpose of that, frankly, was to try and cut through the Gordian knot and reduce some of the many options that we had. So I said at the beginning that it isn't one problem, it's at least three or different perspectives. The stock versus flow, so existing small pots, and we've established there's 11 million-ish of those of under 1,000, versus flow, i.e. future small pots, and we've established that there could be another 15 million of those by 2035. The answer to those is probably slightly different. The first thing you're doing if you've got a leak is to try and stem the leak. In this case, we want rid of them, so we want to get rid of the flow and stop them coming in the first place. There's also a difference between trust-based pots and contract-based. I hesitate to admit it being mostly trust-based, but I'd argue that trust-based is a lot easier than contract-based. We can make decisions on behalf of our members without member consent if we believe it's in the members' interests. It's much, much harder for contract-based to do the same thing. And we haven't got anywhere near addressing the issue of what happens if we want to transfer from contract-based to trust-based or vice versa. And finally, there's push versus pull. Pull being the member making their own decision they want to pull stuff in, or a scheme deciding it wants to pull business from somewhere else. Push is if I'm running a master trust, I want rid of a bunch of small pots. What can I do to get rid of them that is legal and ethical? Now, the pull solution from a member perspective is where the dashboard comes in. Without the dashboard, it's almost impossible. But with the dashboard, it will get rid of at least a very large chunk of the problem, which is members don't know what they've got and don't know how to deal with them. The problem is we all know, I suspect on this call, that members are incredibly apathetic, and getting them to open a letter is difficult, let alone getting them to go and search on the dashboard. I won't talk through this slide in too much detail because there's a lot of detail on it, but I thought it'd be helpful to break down the numbers of different types of small pots. And as you see, there's something of the order of 3.5 million small pots that are less than under £100, so micro pots. And if we're going to try and solve this problem, logic says to me we should aim at the smallest ones first. One, because we can make a big difference from an industry perspective quite quickly, and two, because if it goes wrong, it isn't that much of an issue. Now, that sounds quite complacent, I think is the word. I'm not in the least bit complacent on this. There's a real danger if you transfer someone's pot from someone's £90 pot to another pot where it's 150, that suddenly the £90 pot is now being hit with a charge, a monthly pound top charge, rather than just an AMC. And that could be very detrimental to members, so we've got to think about a way around that. Equally, if we transfer someone, it turns out not to be the right pot that they're getting transferred to, and we'll come on to the quality of data in a second, then there's a real potential for loss there. However, I argue, and I've had agreement from a number of providers, that actually getting these small pots off the books will save them so much money. There's a reasonable expectation that the big players would be happy to fund any compensation scheme because it would cost a fraction of the amount they're going to save by consolidating these small pots. But anyway, that's a few for the full data. So what have we actually done about it? Well, we have made progress in a number of areas. We've done quite a lot of consumer testing. We've done work on a number of transfer models. And we've worked on outlining potential small pot ecosystem and other evidential areas. You can tell this was written by someone from policy bureau type organisation. So that includes consumer journeys, learnings from other countries. So we just try to cast the net as wide as possible to try and identify the things that could go wrong before they go wrong. As a result, we've actually managed to come up with not a solution, but we've cut back on some of the potential solutions that we don't think will actually work. And the end result is we've got lots of considerations for government. We had to temper the language. The report was slightly late coming out because the World and his brother got to comment it before we published it, including government, and we had to use language that they liked. So it was considerations rather than asks for government. But effectively, we've asked for input on potential regulatory changes. Now, this is a much bigger ask than you might think, given the state of the government, frankly. But the amount of time and effort that goes into producing pensions bills, realistically, we can't expect anything to happen in the next 2 years. And therefore, we have to show willing that we can do stuff without legislative changes. And I'll come on to the member exchange policy project in a second. There is still more evidence required. But my argument as chair is that shouldn't delay planning or even movement, as frankly, there's always more evidence that you can get. And what we've got is so blindingly obvious that there's member detriment out there that we've got to do something. And the group has reached a consensus on which models should be considered. And there's 3 models for the 3 key issues. So pot follows member rather than member follows pot. Multiple default consolidators. So we got rid of a single default consolidator because we didn't believe anyone was going to accept that other than the one organisation that thought it might be a default consolidator. And member exchange. I've mentioned this a couple of times, so just to be clear, member exchange, there's a pilot group of 4 of the larger auto enrolment master trusts, so Nest, Now, People's Pension and Smart, who have figured out that we are allowed under the legislation to unilaterally move a group of members from our master trust to another master trust. That's permissible under the law. Realistically, the chairs of those 4 master trusts would only want to do so if they could be really convinced that it's in the members' interest to do so. And we're not going to do it across the board straight away. If we do it, and I'll come back to some issues in a second, then we start with some very small pots where the potential loss is minimal. We'd only choose a small subgroup to test out the systems and the processes. So probably members whose names begin with F and who have a pot size of less than £100 and perhaps even who lived in a particular area. And we try with them and see how it worked. And if that worked, carry it forward to other groups. But it's got to be in the members' interest. Having said all that, it's probable that it's a combination of these models that will be the best solution. Now, in the long term, I'd like to think that the dashboard and the pool solution will be, by some margin, the most popular, because pot sizes will get above minimums. Sorry, it's also worth saying right at the start, there is no definition of small pots. One of the things we struggled with. Now, when we first started, I came up with a potential solution for that, which was just for a working practice. We'd call pot sizes less than £100 micro pots, and then small pots we'd split into 3 or 4 subgroups. 100 to £250, 250 to 500, 500 to 1,000, and 1,000 to 2,000. Anything above 2,000 started to get a little bit big. One of our issues was you wouldn't want to consolidate a pot so that it suddenly became more than £10,000, because then it's, there are access issues that you might be taking away from people being able to take the whole thing as a lump sum. Sorry, not quite accurate, but I think you know where I'm coming from. So we've got some outstanding questions, mostly about the net comparative benefit effect. So we need to look at the overall total number of remaining small pots, and that is a movable feast, as I've said. We're adding to them at the rate of probably between 500,000 and 1 million a year, and furloughing probably increase that even faster. We need to look at the degree with these models impact on long-term financial sustainability of the market. Frankly, there are master trusts out there and even GPPs out there where I'd say this is going to cause a major problem if we don't solve it, particularly as there are some costs like the TPR General Levy and Fraud Compensation Fund that are charged on a pound basis. TPR General Levy and FCF total for a trust-based scheme, £1.20 going up to £1.40, up to £2 in the near future. And if we were to succeed in removing a lot of small pots, then that could even go up higher. Now, if you're a supplier of a master trust and you're suddenly going to be paying upwards of £2 per pot, irrespective of the size, that's when you've got millions of small deferred pots, that's an existential threat. We also need to look at the impact on the auto-enrollment market to ensure it's not undermined and destabilised by the introduction of one or more of the models. We just need to make sure we don't make the whole thing worse rather than better. So our recommendation.
Andy, sorry, just to say that Henry's got a hand raised to
Okay. Yep.
Henry, do you want to quickly ask a question? Yeah, go on.
Yeah. Could you just clarify, Andy, that £2 would be £2 per year, not £2 per month?
Oh, yes, sorry, yeah, £2 per year, but per pot.
Per pot, right,
yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, absolutely, yes, sir, thank you for that. Yeah, there are, I think most of the big master trusts have found a way of consolidating pots within their scheme. Nesta's always only had one pot per member. That causes some issues in terms of it can't share data with the scheme sponsors that are attached to them, because it includes benefits that are not necessarily that provided by that sponsor, but it saves them an awful lot of money in terms of FCF fees and TPR fees. So our recommendations, a further cost benefit analysis to be undertaken on a range of models. One of the issues here is that we've done a lot of this work, but logically you wouldn't expect government just to take our word for it. And we had a long conversations right at the start with DWP and TPR about how much of our word they could take, and they were very happy to rely on our analysis, but in the end they will have to do their own stuff, and I'd be alarmed if they didn't, frankly, because there's always a danger that we can be selective with our data, by accident as well as deliberately. We need more analysis of where the small pots are in the existing system, wider systemic benefits of removing them from savings and schemes. Output from the pensions data project, yet another project that's working, will help. Look at the impact of different models on financial sustainability, as we say. One of, I say, my concerns, I don't know how well, I think there's a nagging concern in DWP, but this hasn't been expressed particularly widely yet, is how much of a barrier to entry is there for auto enrolment with small pots in the UK at the moment. Yeah, as a chair of a big auto enrolment master trust, I'm not very keen on having lots of competitors come into the market, but from a pure individual perspective, I don't want there to be barriers to entry into the market if good people, good organisations can come in, and we don't want to create extra barriers. We also need to make decisions about the model and direction for delivery, governance and funding the project. Where's the money coming from to do this? Some of it, member exchange, for instance, there's enough of a potential gain for the providers that we can just get on and do it, and it's self-funding to a great extent. That isn't necessarily the case of some of the other solutions. We're only taking forward to say pot FOs, member, multiple default consolidators and member exchange. So it sounds simple, but of course it isn't. Our next phase needs to be to select and prioritise models to take forward, understand what changes are needed, which is mostly legislative, to be honest. And that legislation would need to compel all relevant providers to take part in the solutions. That is difficult. There will be some organisations that don't want to be compelled. I've got to say, not too many. If I jump back to member exchange, there were 4 players in that market. Nest has an issue with the way it's set up. They think they can take bulk transfers in, but they can't necessarily do bulk transfers out, which kind of rules them out of a member exchange. It isn't an exchange at that level. People's Pension have concerns over the minimum pension age, which they guarantee in effect at 55, and they want to make sure that that is continued if people move on. But I have to say that there are other master trusts that are prepared to take part in member exchange, and I think we probably will run it, but with a different group, but more than 4 at some stage in the next year or so, just as a test. And then if everybody else is doing it, I suspect those organisations that have contractual or deed and rules reasons for not playing will want to change their deed and rules, because there will be a commercial advantage to those that do play in this market, quite apart from it being better for members. So compulsion for all relevant providers will probably be important. We also enable contract-based providers to carry out non-consented transfers. They can't at the moment, which is, as you'll gather, something of a problem for them. And there's a lot of historic standalone personal pension products that are significantly under £2,000. We need to define the pots in scope. And I think, as I've said before, if we start at £100 or less, that becomes relatively easy. But it does beg a question about, well, where's it transferring? Because you don't want suddenly someone to be starting to pay £1 a month when they weren't paying £1 a month beforehand. So as a rule of thumb, I'd argue that you can transfer a pot of less than £100 to a pot that is greater than £500, and the £1 per month fee charge that some providers apply wouldn't then be a problem. But we need to evidence that. And we need to define the liability model. And frankly, I don't see any way that we're going to do this without the liability ending on one of the providers, either the seeding provider or the accepting provider. One of them is making a profit out of this, at least, and there needs to be a way of splitting the costs between them if something goes wrong. And that stuff going wrong, that's all about identifying members. We know national insurance numbers aren't unique, despite the fact they should be. We've got a real problem with the English language, frankly. For an example, there is, I'm told, only one way to spell Muhammad in Arabic, but there are at least a dozen different ways to spell it in Latin Roman script. 2 H's, 2 M's in the middle, a T or a D at the end, etc. And Kim Gubler, who chairs the data group, points out that her name, the U in that, has an umlaut on it. Now, hands up, anyone on this call, if you know an administrator who knows how to put an umlaut in a typing frame. It doesn't happen. And accents acute and grave. Before you get into Greek and Cyrillic, Russian, or any of the Asian languages, Japanese, Chinese, etc., there is just too much opportunity for us to get names wrong, for names to be the prerequisite that has to be right. We're going to get a load of mismatches and a load of matches that shouldn't be there, that should that are called matches, and vice versa. So there's a lot of issues to get over on that. And I mentioned some of these before in terms of outstanding issues. The £100 de minimis on flat fee charges, like I say, how do you arrange for those to be transferred over? The stronger nudge on guidance, we think that's relatively easy to incorporate. Contract law, not just for contract-based schemes, but what are we allowed to do? Fair value perspectives. If you if you transfer from a master trust that has an overall charge of 40 basis points to one that has an overall charge of 50 basis points, however that is made up, can that still be fair value? I would argue yes, and if it's under the charge cap, we should be able to do it, because otherwise you're making a decision on which has the better default option, which has the better other services. There is a danger there, but I think we can get through that. Pension transfer red flags, we for lots of good reasons, we're seeing this as an issue. I think that this is less of an issue. We don't think scammers are going to be that enticed by the chances of transferring a £100 pot. But the mere fact that I say that makes this higher risk. So we've got to be really careful that we don't transfer unless we're absolutely certain that it's going to the right place. And finally, and I alluded to this earlier, the minimum pension age changes are a real bugbear. I could use a ruder word. Some schemes have an automatic right to keep age 55 retirement age. It would have been an awful lot easier if the government hadn't grandfathered those and said, no, everyone's moving to 57. But they've done what they've done, so we have to find ways around it. And we've got to be careful that if you do agree a transfer from an age 55 scheme to an age 57 scheme, you're not going to be held liable, and you're not worried that most 57 schemes will agree to ring fence such transfers. But what happens if they then transfer on somewhere else? Where is the liability landing on those circumstances? So the devil is always in the detail on these. So in summary, I'm sorry, I've probably gone on a bit long here. They remain an important and growing issue. Since 2021, the number of small and deferred pots is likely to have grown by at least another million, probably more because of furloughing and COVID effects. Equally, we expect more than 11 million small deferred pots by the end of this year, at least because of COVID. Next 10 years, that number is going to double again. Small pots are an issue for everyone, so savers, pension providers and schemes. So we should all be aligned on this. They add inefficiencies to the scheme, to the system, and make it more likely that people lose track of their money. And we've got lots of that. And I know Steve wants to talk about the advice market a little bit. And the longer these issues take to resolve, the greater the number of pots that will be affected, and the more suboptimal outcomes. So it's time for us to get off the pot, basically. And with that, I'll hand you back to Steve.
Get off the pot.
Just to remind you to say, if anyone wants a copy of the slides, if you're that sad, just send me an email and I shall do so. Meanwhile, I shall see if I can exit this. Oh, yeah, good.
So that was that was really good, Andy. Thank you very, very much. And that was get off the pot for small pots. That's your headline grabbing news. Yeah, that was really, really good. Henry, let's start with you. You've made a couple of comments in the chat. I'd like to then come on to Adrian Balding, if possible, because you're probably one of the four that Andy mentioned. But Henry, what comments have you got?
Right, am I off? Yes, I'm off. My first comment is aligned to what Gareth said, which is that we've been told forcibly by the minister that the dashboard is not for transactions, but simply as a place to see what's going on. Do you think that the dashboard will be as helpful in pot consolidation, or is it really just as the minister would say, a non-transactional type vehicle, which won't really move things along that much?
I'm more positive than the minister. I think it will be a useful transactional tool, but in the longer term and less for small pots. Frankly, people with £100 pots around the place probably won't even go onto the dashboard. People with a pot size of £1,000 or £2,000 or £5,000 might go on and start using it for transactions. So I think it's back to the issue I said right at the start. It isn't one problem, it's multiple problems, and it will solve some of the problems, just not most of them.
Okay, and my second question is, in the You mentioned that there were going to be multiple consolidators, and that's one of the models you were working to. How do you work out which the multiple consolidators does the consolidating? Is it a carousel? Is there the original the originator, the first ever provider? Is that the basis for consolidation? What's the basis?
Really good question. Undecided as yes. I would argue though that it'll be push and pull. So if I get a new employee and I also enroll them, once I get, at the moment we're talking about, well, once someone's been in for 3 months, personally I'd probably change that to say, well, once someone's been in your scheme for more than a year and has a pot size of greater than £500, then you can go out and say, right, what other small pots are around, and we'll ask for them and we'll pull them into us. And I think that probably makes sense. So I think it's probably a pull. There may be some push as well. So if I've got a whole bunch of sub £100 pots, I might go to the market and say, we've got Fred and he's got a £99 pot. Do you have a pot that's bigger than 500 quid that we can transfer him to? Just because it's going to be in his interest. So I don't think they're mutually exclusive, but I think the pull will be probably the primary one.
Okay, that's really helpful. Thank you.
Adrian, have you got thoughts on this? As
Steve, yeah, no, thanks. I certainly echo what Andy said, that there's lots of work still to be done down the track. We need a third round of the small pots, working group to crack on with many of those tasks that Andy has set us. But I think my overriding thing is keep the eyes on the prize. And the way that I see this is somebody's money. All of these small pots belong to an individual. That individual had money taken out of their pay packet and put into something which they were told was called a pension. Many of the master trusts here still have the word pension in their title, although of course they don't provide a pension at all. But having a couple of £100 in a plan which is going to stay there and then be given back to you at retirement is of absolutely no use to anybody in terms of achieving the outcome for them, which was to build a retirement income. I'm not saying £200 is worth it. It was an important chunk of their money when it was put in, but it's not going to achieve the object. So if we can find a way that we automatically pick up those small sort of couple of £100 pots and put them somewhere useful where they've got a decent chance of turning into a retirement income along with the rest of the money in the other pot in the fullness of time, then we might actually be able to help these people who've very often got very fragmented careers, a little bit of work there, a little bit of work there, a little bit somewhere else. People with fragmented careers still need exactly the same pension as somebody that had 40 years working at one comfortable insurance company. So if we can help them move that money somewhere it will actually turn into a pension when they retire, then we've done them a good service.
Thanks. I don't disagree with any of Adrian's point there. And I should give him a name check as the guy who was leading the member exchange team as well, though he no longer works for Now Pensions. So I'll throw a question back at him. CDC, we haven't considered at all in member exchange or transfers or whatever. But it seems to me that if there was an effective CDC scheme out there in existence in 5 years, 10 years time, then I'd be quite comfortable with transferring into it. Do you think CDC would accept pure DC transfers? Because they're creating an extra liability in effect, a promise.
It's up to a CDC scheme whether it accepts transfers in or not, same as anything else. A CDC scheme must give transfers out to people up to 1 year short of their retirement age, same as normal occupational scheme rules. So I can't see any reason why a CDC scheme wouldn't accept transfers in. So you could turn it into a consolidated vehicle. It would suffer exactly the same problems with small pots as anything else. If you worked for a few months and the Royal Mail, who are going to be the first CDC scheme, and then you left very quickly for some reason, not many posties do. They mostly stick with it. They love it. But if you did do a few months, then yes, you'd have a few pennies of pension. which again would be a very little. It might actually be paid to you as a pension because it is a pension scheme, but it still doesn't achieve the objective of building a significant and worthwhile retirement, income. So I think CDC will have exactly the same problems with smallpox as elsewhere, but perhaps not quite on the same scale, because when you look at the sort of employers which are going to be in the first wave of CDC schemes, they are by and large being set up by employers that have very stable, workforces. My own postie is very excited about his new pension, but he's been the postie since we moved into the house 20 years ago, so he's done at least 20 years service. And that's just characteristic of the sort of employer that at the moment is being attracted to CDC.
Thanks. And sorry, I realised while I was talking, I can only describe as a brain fart. I couldn't think of what the limit was on £10,000 pots and why you wouldn't want to take a pot was bigger than 10,000. I've now remembered, which is, of course, that then immediately throws you into the money purchase annual allowance. Sorry, into the reduced money purchase annual allowance. So you really don't want to take a drawdown of more than £10,000 as cash, because you will then be limited to only £4,000 a year of contribution, and you don't want to do that by accident. Deliberately fine, but not by accident. Seem to have lost Steve Goddard. So next question, please shout. Looking for hands. David Robbins, can I come to you first?
Hi. Thanks, Andy. I just wondering whether you'd had much pushback from DWP on the models considered, because it seems to me from various things that Guy Offerman has said, whether it's his sort of praising of the Australian model or forwards to various consultation papers where he's talked about allowing members to make sure they're contributing to the right pension for them, or perhaps a slightly lukewarm response to your report, which basically said it's vital we get the right solution. I thank the working group for their work here. It seems to me that he personally is still attached to a kind of member choice model, which was rejected by the 2020 working group. I don't know to what extent that's just the minister's view, or is it grouping more widely? Obviously, there may well be a reasonable Prime Minister's in place, and so his view individually may not matter less from that point. But have you had much sort of pushback on these aren't the right models? You should be looking at that one instead.
No, I don't think it would be fair to say that the minister pushed back on these. I think the minister is understandably and to an extent justifiably frustrated that we haven't just solved the problem. We've pointed out why we can't in many instances, and he's accepted that. We have requirements on us and what we're allowed and what we're not allowed to do. Member exchange is probably the only area where we can just get on and do stuff. And I'd like us to get on and do that. I'd say Guy Offerman is really good at doing stuff. I mean, he's come up with an immense number of initiatives. If anything, too many for the industry. We're trying to do almost too much at the moment. But I think it's really helpful having a minister that is pushing us to do stuff rather than one that's sitting back and trying to stop us doing stuff. And yes, he's a conservative, so he's into member choice, but I think he accepts the point of view of the DWP and others, because it was the DWP chaired group up until 2020, and they've been very positive on everything we've done since. Yes, he was slightly lukewarm, but I think in his response to this report, but I think that's because we didn't just say, yeah, here's a solution, we're getting on with it. And I come back to my point, we need to be seen to be doing something. If we want government to legislate and put aside expensive and difficult parliamentary time to come up with a new pension act, or pension bill at least, then we need to be able to show that we've done something ourselves and at least solved all the problems we can do ourselves. Stephen Glover?
Yeah, Stephen.
Yes, I'm just. Can you hear? Just
Yep.
unmuted. Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Andy. I had a question on member exchange, which is how do you determine members' best interests under a member exchange arrangement? So in other words, wherever you exchange the pot into is bound to have a different investment default strategy than the one that you are transferring from. So is the argument that the pot is so small that the difference in potential investment performance over time, whatever it may be, is going to be negligible? Or is there some other argument?
I think there's a different argument. I'd be very nervous about saying you're not going to lose very much, so it's okay. That cannot be a satisfactory answer. I think what we're saying is this: within member exchange, the only scheme I would transfer to is an authorised master trust. If it's authorised, it's going to give you good value. Yeah. So it's got a maximum set of charges. Charges that it does charge have to present value for money. So if you're paying more, you're getting more typically. There, I know that's self-pleading argument to an extent, but it works. And for people who have a pot size between 100 and 500 pounds, it's almost certainly going to be much lower charges for organisations that have a pound sign charge as well as an AMC. And those are the ones we were talking about starting with. Where we can prove it is very much in members' interest, it becomes really easy. Now, we can never say smart investment performance will be better than Nest's or vice versa or anyone else's, because over what time scale to start with, and even if it has a lower performance, if it has lower risk along the way, you've still had better value. So I think we have to rely on the Master Trust Authorisation Programme and continuing authorisation and the value for money programmes we go through. I haven't heard anyone argue, oh, we can't possibly transfer from a 40 basis point scheme to a 50 basis point scheme because it would be poor value for them. Because there's so many other things that come into it, whether it's investment, communication, access at retirement, what your options are. There's a myriad of different criteria that you can apply.
No, just go to what Adrian was talking about. Is there any consideration given to a minimum size for the consolidated pot once that's achieved, which is actually going to lead to a pension of any consequence? Or is there any thought of a cutoff level, below which it's an empty promise to say that, that this is going to lead to a pension, and therefore we suggest you take back your pot or transfer into some other vehicle?
Not quite in the way you've described it. So a transfer to another master trust under member exchange, for instance, or any of these, you'd probably be transferring to an active pot. I think that is the requirement, and therefore you're saying, well, that pot should grow to be much bigger in the long term. But I would say, back to the if there is a pound sign charge monthly, £1, £1.50, some of them charge, I wouldn't want to transfer to one of those unless the accepting scheme had at least £500 in it, because that would take it to £600. And when you run the maths, that should mean that the charge will be lower overall. But it's a very good point, and we haven't come up with a very defined solution to that. So yes, it's all up for grabs in the arguments that we have.
Just to be clear, a very naive question. When you say transfer into another pot with a minimum 500 size, is that £500 of the same person's money?
Yes, sorry, you have the same person's money. Yes, yeah.
Good.
Yeah, good question, Stephen. That's really good. Andy, a quick question from me, and I know Dave's got his hand raised again. A lot of us will remember the great world of vesting. There used to be a 5-year vesting rule, and then it became a 2-year vesting rule. Surely, in terms of stop the rot, wouldn't it be better to reintroduce through legislation like a 1-year vesting rule or something like that? Reintroduce it. It stops the rot for doubling the amount of pots. Well, why can't we just do a vesting rule, and then everybody, whether it's personal pension or master trust, under 12 months, boom, 80% back, 20% tax. There you go, no problem. Why can't that be considered?
Good question. First, TPR won't allow it. They've various solutions along those lines have been suggested over the last 4 or 5 years, and they've always been rebutted, because the purpose of auto enrolment is to get small pots in. Even if someone's has a series of short-term employments, builds up a number of 3-month pots, they should be aggregated, and eventually they'll build up to a decent sized pot. So there's no way the pension regulator or the DWP is going to agree, because it flies in the face of auto enrolment. However, one of the points that I've made is outside the remit of the small pot stuff, but there is an issue for industry in respect of non-UK nationals. So I would argue that we should have a 2-year vesting refund of contributions for those individuals who can show that they were auto-enrolled in the UK when they worked in the UK, that they have always been non-UK nationals, and they've now gone back to wherever they came from and have been tax residents outside the UK for at least 2 years. Now, go back more than a decade when I was a consultant. At one point I was an investment consultant to Nest, and one of the points I made to them was that I reckoned that by now, so 10 years later, around about 20 to 25% of their deferred pots would be for UK non-residents. So think Polish plumbers, Czech chambermaids, Kiwi barmen. Nothing I have seen leads me to think I was wrong. If anything, it's probably an underestimate. The problem is Nest and no one else knows where these people live, because you've got a UK address, you send a statement to them, and it comes back not at this address. The fact that they declared themselves to be a Kiwi national to start with, they might not be in New Zealand now, they might have gone somewhere else, but we know they're not in the UK, or if you do tracking through DWP. But I'd argue those people, we could probably cut the number of small pots by 20 to 25%. And that would be good for the industry, and probably good for the individual, because they have a pot, and absolutely certainly good for HMRC, because there's no way they get their refund without HMRC taking a cut. So I think we'd have limited amounts of resistance to that. But we have to quantify the size of the problem first. That's really difficult, as I say, because you can't. How do you prove something that can't be proved where someone lives?
Tough. That's a tough one. And then you've got tracing services abroad in Poland and Czech Republic and New Zealand, which sounds a can of worms in itself.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, again, you run into the reverse of the language difficulties. So if they're not using Latin Roman script, how have they reverted to the original spelling of their name in whatever it is, Slovak? And you get some very strange anomalies.
Yep. Okay. We've got a few advisors on the call, I'm sure. I want to talk a little bit about advice. Where can IFAs or advisors help in this space, do you think? Because people need help, but actually they're not prepared to pay for that help. So there is this conundrum that, what is a small pot? Well, if a small pot is, if I've got 4 small pots of £5,000, that's 20 grand. If I've got 4 small pots of 100, that's £400. So can the advisory community help at all, Andy, in this space?
They can do. There are 2 caveats. One, I have no idea how cost effective it would be for them. Well, I say I've got no idea. I know it wouldn't be cost effective for them, but that's their problem if they're willing to do it. But I'm also nervous about organisations that might seek to acquire transfers without making sure it's in the members' interest. So there are 2 categories. So there are out and out scammers, which I've already said I'm concerned about, but there's also organisations that might say, oh, don't worry about any penalties you might get. We want your money anyway. And then impose a charge considerably over the charge cap. So I'm really nervous about anyone who's going to charge more than the charge cap. Accepting that might be really good value for some people, I suspect it isn't going to be good value for anyone with anything that anyone here would call a small pot, anything less than a couple of £1,000. I think you're on mute, Steve.
There you go. Yeah, and Martin Tingle's just put in the chat about maps. What do you think about maps? Maps could have a role somewhere there with guidance on small pots, or is that part of your strategy as well, or not?
Maps are certainly involved, and we would definitely look to use them as a check. We have to have lots of checks and balances in here. Most of this has been driven by, I say, ABI and PLSA, but we all recognise that if we just went full market review on that, full market driven on this, then all the nice stuff would get pinched up, but the small non-cost effective stuff we left in abeyance. So we've got to have something that works for everybody. And I think Maps has a good role to play in it. I think they could offer guidance, but I'd like to think they will be doing that anyway. And frankly, Maps have enough on their plate as it is with Dashboard and similar. So we've got to make it easy for people to make a decision.
Yeah. Yeah, that's
so
true.
I'd be very interested in hearing from any of the advisors whether they'd want to play in this market or could.
Well, it's economics, isn't it? That's the
Yeah.
bottom line. A lot of advisors will have minimum fees, and yeah, maybe they can help with a form of education or guidance for them. But yeah, in terms of holistic advice, it's going to be a struggle, isn't it? That's a lot of level 4, level 6, especially advisors will have to provide holistic advice, and then that's crossing over into other areas as well, of which a small pot might form one of them. So. And do you think there's an opportunity, two other things, an opportunity with consolidators? I mean, you mentioned consolidators in the presentation, but is there going to be a consolidator that's going to take a major lead? We had, as Henry will recall, Pension B 3 or 4 weeks ago. Do people like Pension B play a part in this journey? Do you think they'll help in this space?
Personally, I don't think so now. Because I'm looking for someone who has a charge structure that's considerably under the charge cap. I think is where the bulk of this stuff is going to happen. And then if they want to persuade a member that what the services they offer are valuable enough that the member should pay a higher level of charge, then fine. But I can't see it working in an automatic transfer. Automatic transfers have to be to something that is well within the charge cap.
Yeah. Okay. No, I appreciate that. Gareth Morgan, you've made a couple of comments on the chat. Do you want to make a point to Andy or the group?
Yeah, still here. Sorry.
Hi, Gareth. Yeah.
I don't think so. I mean, I think my only concern really is the one about member comes first. Quite a lot of the arguments and points have been made about the advantages commercially to the kind of the trusts and the pension providers. I'm really just kind of nervous about the effect of effectively being pushed somewhere else on the members, but I just don't know enough about it to be aware of kind of what the consequences are, given that the sums, surprisingly, even in benefit terms that we're talking about, are pretty low.
I absolutely agree with Gareth, and sorry, was Gareth? I can't see on it.
It's Gareth.
Yes, Gareth. Yeah. I think you're right to be concerned about that. It's why I keep on coming back to. But is it in the interest of the member? And for instance, it's a reason why we're starting with really small pots. Ideally, I think you'd say between £100 and £500, because then you know that they're not being hit with an increased charge under any circumstances, i.e. the pound sign charge. And I think that's why we're starting small. And I think it becomes much harder to argue for automatic transfers when the pot size gets up to beyond 1,000 to 2,000, or certainly above 2,000. And I'd be very nervous of us extending beyond that. At the moment, the vast majority of these small pots are really small anyway, so it becomes easy. Whoever's doing this job in 10 years' time might have a different set of problems to deal with, but that won't be my problem. And hopefully, please God, we don't have the same problem with all the small £100 pots, sub £100 micro pots.
Absolutely. Yeah, Gareth, do you agree with that?
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense, and certainly when you get moving up into the thousands of pounds bit, then you start getting to a situation where things can really be affected in terms of the other income and benefits and so forth. So I'd be much happier with Andrew's micro pots moves than I would with anything bigger.
Yeah. And then the problem you've got with micro pots, Andy, of course, is if you've got a £100 pot and the TPR levy goes up to £2 or £4, you're then talking about the provider suffering a charge more than the cap. So
Absolutely.
Which is like, well, hang on a minute, if we can only charge 0.75 but the levy's 1% effectively because of the small pot, then that's crazy, isn't it? That's Armageddon.
It's already the case. So if you think 3.5 million pots of less than £100, you're not allowed to charge a pound sign charge. So the most you can charge is 75 pence on £100. But you're paying a minimum £1.20 in TBF general levy, TPR general levy rather. Plus you've still got to do statements and all the rest of it. So you are losing money on all of those. So it's a real incentive for the providers to do something.
To get rid, yeah.
But meanwhile, people like me wearing my trustee hat and TPR and DWB and FCA are looking over and saying, well, make sure whatever you do, you're not doing it to the detriment of the member.
But the levy itself is a detriment to the provider, which looks after the member. So they're not helping, are they? Really?
Yeah.
So
well, like I say, I can only see. Well, we know that it's planned that the TPR levy and FCF will gradually increase to, I can't remember the number now, but it will be £2 relatively soon, within the next 2 or 3 years, I think. And I genuinely expect that to go up to 3 or 4 within the decade. And that's suddenly you're talking about a real incentive to do something, which is good.
Oh, well, indeed. No, absolutely. I appreciate that. Yeah. Okay. Again, if anybody's got an amazing idea that hasn't been discussed or thought of, I'm sure Andy would love to hear about it. You've got Andy's email address on there. I really appreciate your presentation, Andy. It's a small, big issue, but it sounds like we've got to get off the pot to sort out the pots, which is great. It's going to trundle on for some time. Strangely enough, you mentioned briefly there about scamming. We've got Margaret Snowden next week giving everybody an update on pension scamming. And actually, exactly what you've talked about today suggests that we've got to be very careful as an industry and as providers to make sure that the scammers don't get hold of the 100 quid here, 400 quid there, 800 quid wherever, and scam small pot providers and small pot members. So pension scamming will be part and parcel of this, I guess, as well. So it'd be interesting to see what Margaret has to say next week. But genuinely, if anybody has got any ideas that hasn't been heard or thought of, I'm sure Andy would like to hear from you. That would be good. And if you'd like a copy of the slideshow, message me or email me or Henry, and we'll get it for you. And we really, really appreciate everybody joining today. And as I say, it's an issue which is growing, sadly growing. and it sounds it sounds like an ever decreasing circle, Andy, and it's just going to get worse. It just sounds like it's going to get worse. So it's a great topic, and I'm sure it won't be the last time we talk about it. But I really, really appreciate your time. There's lots of people clapping on online, which is good. And this will be, we'll post this as well, this video online for the others that couldn't make it. If you are not on Pension Playpen, please sign up to Pension Playpen. If you love Pension Playpen as much as I do, then you can invite colleagues to join via our Invite Friends tab. And as I say, at the end of all of these sessions, we are praying for peace in the East. That's what we really, really want. Thanks again to Andy for his time and his presentation. Thanks for all your questions. Have a safe day. Have a great week. And we'll hopefully see you next Tuesday when Margaret Snowden will be better, fully recovered from COVID, and be telling us about pension scamming, another challenge for our industry. So enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks very much, everybody, and take care. All right. See you later.
Bye now.
Cheers. Bye.